Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew, the founder and owner of Ibis Prep, and today we are doing the Con Law MBE live interactive questions, and it should be a lot of fun for the February 2026 bar exam. So, Morgan, if you don't mind, could you share your screen?
Yeah, hold on just a second. Share. Oh, here.
Amazing. So, what Morgan is sharing is the question bank that we're creating as a class, and then also we're going to do adaptable questions this time. We did UWorld the last two times. I just want to mix it up a little bit. Could you make it just con law instead of contracts and torts?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Mm,
And then there's a poll. Can everyone see the poll? Yeah, good. None of y'all answered prematurely. That's a good sign. So there's a poll up, and if you think you know the right answer, just click it. I don't know what answers you choose, so don't feel nervous that I'm judging you. Um, just pick your answer. All right, let's start
Wait, Andrew, I can't answer, can I?
yeah, you can.
On the poll?
Yeah, you
I
can pick on
can't
the
see
poll.
it.
You should be able to see it. Sometimes if you can't see the poll, just go down to the bottom and click poll quizzes. Here, I'll
MBE.
relaunch it so you guys can see it.
Oh, now I can see it.
Now you guys can see it. Okay. All right, let's do the very first one. Let's see how it goes. Okay. Nice short question. So, in this case, the court should rule how a major city in a particular state is a center for businesses that assemble personal computers. Components for these computers are manufactured elsewhere in the state and in other states, then shipped to the city where the computers are assembled. Sorry. An ordinance of the city imposes a special licensing tax on all of the many companies engaged in the business of assembling computers in that city. The tax payable by each such company is a percentage of the company's gross receipts. The state statute that authorizes municipalities to impose this license tax has a state content provision. To comply with this provision of the state law, the city license tax ordinances provides that the tax paid by any assembler of computers subject to this tax ordinance will be reduced by a percentage equal to the proportion of computer components manufactured in the state. A prominent company assembles computers in the city and sells them from its offices in the city to buyers throughout the United States. All the components of its computers come from outside the state. Therefore, the company must pay the city license tax in full without receiving any refund. Other city computer assemblers use components manufactured in the state in varying proportions and therefore are entitled to partial reductions of their city license tax payments. Following prescribed procedure, the company brings an action in proper court asking to have the city's special license tax declared unconstitutional on the ground that is inconsistent with the negative implications of the Commerce Clause. In this case, the court should rule how? Against the prominent company because the tax falls on companies residents. I'm sorry, against the prominent company because the tax falls on companies resident in the major city and therefore does not discriminate against or otherwise adversely affect interstate commerce. Against the prominent company because the Commerce Clause does not interfere with the right of a state to foster and support businesses located within its borders by encouraging its residents to purchase the products of those businesses. For the prominent company because any tax on a company engaged in interstate commerce measured in whole or in part by its gross receipts is a per se violation of the negative implications of Commerce Clause. And then finally, for the prominent company because the tax improperly discriminates against interstate commerce by treating in-state products more favorably than out-of-state products. Yeah, if you can, you can scroll up a little bit, let people kind of reread the question and scroll back down. All right. Let's try to pick your final answer.
Andrew, is it possible for you guys to make the screen bigger?
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Can you guys make the screen bigger, please?
You can actually zoom in and out on your own. On like on your own screen, you have the capability to zoom in and out. So this is a tough question because of the length of it, but yeah, you can't really zoom out in anymore. Um, yeah, Morgan, do you mind scrolling up just real quickly again to see the whole question? Yeah, and then you can scroll back down to the answers. All right, so most people in the class, the majority of the class picked answer choice D. Um, does anyone, think that D is the correct answer and want to explain why they think that? Also, yeah, Morgan, someone's asking if you can click the three lines at the top to see if that makes a difference with the screen. If you scroll up a little bit. I guess next to practice questions, those three lines. Oh no, not those three lines. The three arrows to the right, right above text highlight. Yeah, I think if you click that, yeah, there we go. That makes it a little bit better. All right, nice. No one really has any input on why they think it's D. Does anyone have any input why they think A, B, or C is the correct answer? Okay. I mean, I would pick D as well here. I think it does discriminate against interstate commerce because look what D's saying. If you scroll down a little bit to D, it says that it improperly discriminates against interstate commerce by treating in-state products more favorably than out-of-state products. I mean, that is true, right? The in-state products, if they're manufactured within the state, they get a reduction in tax. If they're manufactured out of the state, they have to pay a higher tax. I mean, it seems to be uh, facially discriminating against products that are manufactured out of the state. And it doesn't seem to pass any burning test about why this is the case and what it's protecting. It just seems to be something that is favoring in-state products over out-of-state products. So class is pretty quiet today, but let's try D. Nice. So D is correct. A regulation discriminating against out-of-state businesses is presumptively invalid against the Dormant Commerce Clause, absent important non-economic interests with no reasonable alternatives. Here, the higher tax on companies using out-of-state component manufacturers promotes local economic interests by disincentivizing the use of out-of-state businesses and thus is presumptively unconstitutional. If you scroll down to the extended explanation, I mean, it's pretty complex, but as they're saying, D is correct. The court should rule in favor of the company because the ordinance imposition of a higher tax on companies using components from out-of-state manufacturers violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. When such a tax policy is imposed on the use of out-of-state business entities in service of protecting local economic interests, the regulation is presumptively invalid. To be upheld, a regulation that intentionally discriminates against out-of-state businesses must serve an important non-economic interest without any reasonable alternatives available. Here, the higher tax on companies that use out-of-state manufacturing components is plainly intended to protect local interests without any mention of a non-economic interest, which is constitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause. So if you go, Morgan, to the cram guide, I'm gonna start, working on today's one. So con law, let's make it in the middle and a little bit bigger. And then, you should always just try to use your own language to write a quick point that'll help you remember this if you see it in practice and be able to get the answer right. So this one, I mean, my reasoning was pretty much uh, if a state charges higher taxes for components manufactured outside of the state compared to those manufactured inside of the state. This presumptively violates the Dormant Commerce Clause by discriminating against out-of-state commerce. Anyone have any issues with that question? Dormant Commerce Clause is tough. There's two exceptions that are heavily tested, which are the market participant rule and when it's expressly authorized by Congress. Here, none of the exceptions applied, and there was no evidence that it would survive the balancing test because, they were just saying they're charging more for economic reasons, but not something that was like super important that there was no reasonable alternative or anything like that. It was just pure discrimination for economic reasons. All right, let's try the next question. Okay. Which of the following best states the burden of persuasion in this action? And to me, this is like when you're doing con law, you have to know these, the burdens of persuasion, the levels of scrutiny, and the exact language. There's definitely going to be multiple questions that hinge on your knowledge of the language. So state law provides some funding for public schools on a per student basis from general state revenues, which primarily come from the state income and state taxes. The law also provides that all other public monies used to support public schools in the state come from locally levied real estate taxes. This results in a large disparity in per state funding among the state's many public school districts because some districts have higher property values per student than other districts. Public school students who claim to be disadvantaged by this school funding law have challenged the law solely on the ground that it violates the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Which of the following best states the burden of persuasion in this action? The state must demonstrate that the law is necessary to vindicate a compelling state interest. The state must demonstrate that the law is rationally related to a legitimate interest. The students must demonstrate that the law is not rationally related to any legitimate interest, or the students must demonstrate that the law is not substantially related to an important state interest. What do you think about this one, Morgan? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna say C because
Nice.
I feel like it's rational basis because um it's talking about funding for a school and just because students who are disadvantaged by the school funding law who may be more economically disadvantaged, it doesn't matter. Like economics and wealth is considered on a rational basis.
Right. And if anyone ever grew up in the world of America, you see this all the time. Like, um, when I was living here in Miami when I was real young, I was in like the Palmetto district, which is a good public school comparatively to, you know, some other schools, right? And it was totally based on, yeah, Palmetto's in Pinecrest. It's a lot of rich families there and they have a higher tax basis. And then when I moved to Philadelphia, I went to a decent school, but it was just based on, the surrounding neighborhood and how much money people had. If I would have gone to school Lower Marion in the main line, they probably have much nicer facilities based on, their funding. So this is something that happens all the time in society, and you do have a right to direct the education of your child, right to just choose if he goes to school, public school, private school, homeschooled, or whatever, but you don't have a right to a publicly funded education. And this wasn't targeted discrimination. It was just the effect was that there was you know, a disparity, but it wasn't targeting them. Yeah, and Luis is saying the use of zip codes, all these things. I mean, this is definitely common. So I agree with you, Morgan. That's a solid answer. Let's go with C. Most of the class agreed with you as well. This would be a rational basis where the plaintiff has the burden of proof, right? The court will apply one of the three standards. If it's a fundamental right, strict scrutiny. If it's a quasi-suspect right, it would be intermediate. Um, but here, it's any other classification. The action will be upheld unless the action is not rationally related to legitimate government interest. The burdens on the plaintiff under rational basis. Public school students are not part of a suspect or quasi-suspect class, and rational basis applies. So in the cram guide, I'm just going to say if students are suing a school because of the disparate impact of tax dollar funding. The standard will be rational basis because no fundamental right is implicated and students are not a suspect or quasi-suspect class. The burden is on the students to prove that the state action is not rationally related to a legitimate government interest. Right? That one, I think that was an easier question. So far we've seen a nice dormant commerce clause question followed by a scrutiny level question. Very typical of what you'll expect on the bar exam. There's going to be some ridiculously hard con law questions, but the first two I think were fair. All right. Should the court grant the motion? Under state law, a drug company that makes a false factual claim about a prescription drug is strictly liable in tort to any user of the drug. In an advertisement promoting sales of a particular drug, a drug company claimed that the drug was safe for children. Suit was filed against the company on behalf of a child who allegedly was harmed as a result of taking the drug. At the time the child took the drug, the available medical studies supported the company's claim that the drug was safe for children. But later research proved that the drug was actually harmful to children. The company has moved to dismiss the suit on First Amendment grounds. Should the court grant a motion? No, because false or misleading commercial speech is not constitutionally protected. No, because the drug business is subject to extensive health and safety regulation. Yes, because liability cannot be imposed for false statements without a showing of actual malice. Or yes, because the company's claims about the drug were a matter of public concern. So because this is a practice, we know this is a common law question, which kind of takes C and D out of the running because those are talking about defamation here. And it's not really defamation, it's more about constitutional protection. Commercial speech is typically subject to a level of intermediate scrutiny where it's narrowly tailored to an important government interest and substantially related to that purpose. But this isn't even regular commercial speech. This is what's known as false or misleading commercial speech. And even if it was believed to be true, it doesn't matter. It's an objective test. If the commercial speech was false or misleading, it does not receive constitutional protection. So, in the matter of time, I agree with what the class is saying that A is the best answer here. This was false or misleading speech that has no constitutional protection, so they won't be able to dismiss the suit on First Amendment grounds. The company had no constitutional right to false or misleading speech, right? And they could be held liable for this. So I like A with the class. Pretty much just a classic statement that the drug companies claim that the drug was safe for children's commercial speech because it promoted the sale of a commercial product. The court should not grant the motion to dismiss because the U.S. Supreme Court precedent establishes that the First Amendment does not protect commercial speech that's false or misleading, regardless of whether the speaker knew that the speech was false or misleading. Okay, so pretty straightforward takeaway. False or misleading commercial speech is not protected under the First Amendment, regardless of whether the speaker knew that the speech was false or misleading. All right, pretty good start, right? Nothing too crazy. We have false or misleading commercial speech. We have a rational basis for public school funding. And then we had a dormant commerce clause question where they were charging more for out-of-state manufacture. Some good fundamental concepts so far. All right, how about this one? In this case, the reviewing court would probably hold that the act to be blank. The Federal Computer Abuse Act establishes the Federal Computer Abuse Commission, authorizes the commission to issue licenses for the possession of computers on terms that are consistent with the purpose of the act, and makes the unlicensed possession of a computer a crime. The provisions of the Federal Computer Abuse Act are inseverable. A user applied to the Federal Computer Abuse Commission for a license to possess a computer. The commission held and the user participated in a trial type proceeding on the user's license application. In that proceeding was demonstrated that the user repeatedly and intentionally used computers to introduce secret destructive computer programs, computer viruses, into electronic data banks without the consent of the owners. As a result, the commission denied the user's application for a license. The license denial was based on a commission rule authorized by the Computer Abuse Act that prohibited the issuance of computer licenses to persons who had engaged in such conduct. Nevertheless, the user retained and continued to use his computer. He was subsequently convicted of the crime of unlicensed possession of a computer. On appeal, he challenged the constitutionality of the licensing provision of the Federal Computer Abuse Act. It's a tough question. In this case, the reviewing court would probably hold the act to be constitutional because the Constitution generally authorizes Congress to enact all laws that are necessary and proper to advance the general welfare, and Congress could reasonably believe that the possession of computers by people like the user constitutes a threat to general welfare. Constitutional because Congress may use the authority vested in it by the Commerce Clause to regulate the possession of computers, and the provisions of this act do not violate any prohibitory provision of the Constitution. Unconstitutional because Congress may not impose a criminal penalty on action as improper merely because it's inconsistent with an agency rule, or unconstitutional because the mere possession of a computer is a wholly local matter that's beyond the regulatory authority of Congress. Take your time with this. If you want to scroll up just a little bit, Morgan, so I can see the whole question. Yeah, and then scroll back down to D after a minute. So I'm seeing that not many people are picking A as an answer, and that's good because typically the necessary and proper clause is not a good answer on the MBE unless it's joined with another power, like the Commerce Clause or the tax and spending power, because it doesn't give Congress independent power to do anything. It just justifies all their other powers. So between A and B is definitely a better answer because you would go with Commerce Clause than over necessary and proper. Now, for C and D, I just don't really believe in either C or D. I don't think that C is true. I think they can impose criminal penalty, and possession of a computer is a wholly local matter. So they're saying it's intrastate and not interstate, but that's not necessarily true because, viruses can be global, right? There's a lot of Russian and I don't know. I didn't mean to single out Russia, but there's a lot of other countries out there that have cybersecurity attacks in America. So there's especially interstate cybersecurity concerns. So I do think it is amongst the avenues of interstate commerce. So I agree with most of the class here, right? That B is probably the strongest answer. And a good thing is between A and B, you always want to go with B over A if it's Commerce Clause versus necessary and proper clause, because the necessary and proper clause does not vest independent power to Congress. The Commerce Clause does. So I think B is the correct answer. Do you agree with us, Morgan? We'll see. If we're wrong, I'm
Well,
wrong.
I picked C, but now I'm like, that makes sense because at first I was like, how does that relate to the Commerce Clause? But then I was thinking about it and I was like, computers technically can be instrumentalities of interstate commerce, so that makes sense. But like,
Yeah,
I don't know.
definitely. And the whole virus thing too is interstate. But let's see. It could be C, but I think B is a better answer. I just don't think C is true. I think they're allowed to have criminal. Yeah. Congress has the power to criminalize certain types of conduct by enacting statutes, which may be prosecuted by executive agencies that have been delegated the authority to do so by Congress. So C is just not a true statement. Where B is correct. They have broad power in the Commerce Clause, allowing for regulation of articles moving the stream of commerce, which includes regulating possession of computers. The licensing provision does not violate any other constitutional provision, is therefore constitutional. So if you scroll down to the extended explanation, they're just explaining the necessary and proper clause. Congress may not, however, adopt a law that is expressly prohibited by another provision of the Constitution. And then they go into the Commerce Clause, and B is correct. One of the most important powers is its authority to regulate commerce among the states. They can regulate the channels of interstate commerce, the instrumentalities, articles moving in interstate commerce, or activities that have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. So they have broad power to regulate the stream of commerce, including possession of computers. A is incorrect because Article 1, Section 8 does not grant Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper to appropriately carry the duties of the branch of government. It gives Congress the power to tax and spend, which is subject to the requirement that such actions serve the general welfare. There's no independent congressional power to regulate for the general welfare. It would have to be regulate commerce or tax and spend, not just pure regulation. And then C is incorrect because, there's one case, United States versus Grimaud, right? And that's what I tell people, like, if you really want to learn about con law, go check that case out and read through it, and it'll probably give you some insight. Because at the end of the day, it's like, civil procedure, go over the federal rules of civil procedure. For torts, go over the restatement of torts, right? For con law, you kind of have to piece together a bunch of cases to get holdings that will create, all of the possibilities that can be tested, right? I mean, and that's not like necessary to do to, go to the source material, but it is very helpful. And if you want to score highest on the exam, then I would recommend that. It's something to do after, doing everything we do in the class, the PowerPoints, the questionnaires, the cram guides, the practice questions, and things like that. Um, yeah, I'll go to the cram guide and add a point here, which is that um, Congress has the ability to regulate the sale of computers. For example, under the Commerce Clause, um, Congress does not have authority to regulate for the general welfare under the Necessary and Proper Clause because this does not grant them any particular authority. The necessary and proper clause must be used in conjunction with the Commerce Clause or the taxing and spending power, for example. And I'd say furthermore, Congress can enact legislation that carries criminal penalties. All right, let's try another question. So we saw Dormant Commerce Clause and we saw Commerce Clause. Remember, Commerce Clause allows Congress to act. The Dormant Commerce Clause prevents the states from enacting certain types of acts and legislation that would discriminate against interstate commerce or unduly burden interstate commerce. Um, Someone said, I heard somewhere that if you don't know the answer for Constitution, there's Commerce Clause and answer choice to pick it. Is that a good approach, Andrew? You honestly probably heard that from me. I don't know if anyone else would have the balls to say that, but I say that just because I've done this test now for a whole decade, it seems. And yeah, the Commerce Clause is a common answer. And what I've taught people is, everyone, you're not unique if you come to me and say, Andrew, guess what? I always narrow it down to two and pick the wrong one. I'm like, yeah, you and every other person who's ever taken this test, like, that you've done half the battle. You've picked the right answer, but now you got to pick the right reasoning, right? And when it comes to the reasoning, pick the answer that's correct, right? If you know it, you know it. That's always the best idea. But when it comes down to, a totally 50-50, you don't know between the two, you have no um, grounds for determining which one is better. My general advice is pick the answer that's been more common of a right answer in practice, that's been a more familiar right answer, just because statistically, they're trying to test something that they have tested in practice, and, they're trying to lead you to that same answer choice. So, like, don't just blindly pick the Commerce Clause because you see it as a choice. But if you're stuck between two and it's Commerce Clause, or let's say it's necessary and proper, or it's Commerce Clause and it's I don't know, some other congressional power that you haven't seen as a common answer, go with the more popular choice in practice. That's what I mean by that. So like, be very wary to be like just blindly picking answers because someone told you to do that. But, if you're totally stuck and you don't know which answer to pick the answer that's been more commonly correct in practice. And that's kind of just like why um, doing practice questions is so beneficial because it helps you figure out which answer choices are popular. Like the independent and adequate grounds answer is kind of a popular one in con law, or the Commerce Clause is a pretty popular one. So it's like, it'll help train that muscle and lead you to the right answer, but also be careful because like if you just tell yourself, oh, Andrew told me if I see Commerce Clause to pick it, like that is not true. That's not true at all. It's just if you're totally stuck and it's between Commerce Clause and something like necessary and proper, it's more likely Commerce Clause just based on it tends to be a more common correct answer. Um, Okay. So, to preserve the appearance and accessibility of its Capitol building, a state enacted a law prohibiting the display of any sign on any portion of the public sidewalk surrounding the building. A group of five demonstrators who wanted to protest inadequate state funding for children's services applied for a permit to march single file on a sidewalk surrounding the Capitol building. Each demonstrator planned to carry a 2-foot square sign that would read, "Our lawmakers do not care about our children." The group's permit application was denied pursuant to the state law, and the group has filed an action constituting the law's constitutionality. Should the court uphold the law's constitutionality? So here, this is another what level of scrutiny are we going to apply, right? It's not prohibiting any sign talking about politicians, any sign talking about the San Francisco 49ers, right? It doesn't seem to be content based. It just seems to be um, more content neutral, right? It's just any sign that, you know, they're carrying. So no, because even though the sidewalk at issue is not a public forum, the prohibition against the display of the sign is more restrictive than needed to serve legitimate government interests. Well, the sidewalk is a public forum. That's like the definition of a public forum. So I don't even like it at all. No, because the sidewalk at issue is a public forum. I believe that. And the prohibition against the display is a sign of signs is not narrowly tailored to serve a substantial government interest. That one does seem to include the intermediate scrutiny of time, place, and manner restrictions, right? It's heightened because it's narrowly tailored, but it's intermediate because it's a substantial government interest. I don't know. Is Melissa here today? I don't know if she's here. Yeah, Melissa, see, I know you mentioned to Katya, oh, it's supposed to be a significant government interest, but you can see this is an NCBE question and they use substantial in their answer choice too. So like sometimes you know a little bit more than them and you just gotta like get on their level
Yeah.
and not overthink
Yeah,
it.
I
Yeah.
saw that and it still drives me crazy, but at least now I know to not overthink it and just
Yeah.
frickin' pick it.
Yeah, shut up and pick it, right? That's Jonathan Grossman's favorite mantra. I have a funny story about that after this question, but also, don't be mad at me, be mad at the NCBE. They wrote it and we just kind of tried to follow their lead. Yes, because even though the sidewalk at issue is a public forum, the prohibition against the display of the signs is necessary to serve a compelling government interest. So that sounds like strict scrutiny. And yes, because the sidewalk at issue is not a public forum and the prohibition against the signs is reasonable. Well, I don't like A and D. I mean, a sidewalk is as public of a forum as a public forum can get, right? So between B and C, we're talking about strict scrutiny, which would be C, necessary to achieve a compelling government interest, or heightened intermediate scrutiny, narrowly tailored to serve a substantial government interest, which is the proper test for time, place, and manner. Go ahead, Nick. You have a question?
Yeah, I guess you were gonna get to it, but I picked D for this one. My reasoning for D is because I thought sidewalks could be restricted. They're not necessarily private public property if basically the sidewalk is next to like a government building, for example, or something along that lines. But just going forward, no matter what, sidewalks, we got to just consider them public forum.
I mean, this sidewalk is next to the Capitol building. So you're right, that's a public sidewalk. If it was a sidewalk, in a a gated community, that would probably be a private sidewalk. So I may have overstepped there by said, sidewalks are always public forums. But like a public sidewalk, a sidewalk in the middle of town next to, a Capitol building is very clearly a public sidewalk. So you're right.
Gotcha.
And then I like what Justin's saying, content neutral, intermediate scrutiny, and Grace is saying, but in favor of the community, right? Should the court uphold the law's constitutionality? And we're saying no here because it's not narrowly tailored, meaning that like, there's they wanted to preserve the appearance and accessibility. So maybe they could have limited the size or something. Maybe it could have been like any sign over 2 feet, square by square. Like maybe that would have been more thinly tailored, but like any sign, you can't even hold like a small little picture up. It seems, yeah, like Justin's saying, it's a little bit overbroad. It's not narrowly tailored. So B is the best answer. But again, you're not necessarily going for who's right or wrong. You're more going for what's the proper standard to utilize. So if they would have said yes, because the prohibition is narrowly tailored to serve a substantial government interest, and it was the only answer choice that used that language, I would pick that answer, right? Like, who am I? I'm not the court. I mean, as some students have pointed out, there's probably a Supreme Court case that is exactly, mimics these facts. So it is a no answer. But like, it's more important that you use the right terminology than you come to the right conclusion when it comes to these scrutiny level answer choices. So I like what the class is saying, that B is the best answer here. Let's go with B. So B is correct. The ban on all signs on any part of the public sidewalk is not nearly tailored to serve an interest in preserving the appearance and accessibility of the Capitol building as required for time, place, and manner restrictions. So D is incorrect. The sidewalk is a public forum, right? And C is incorrect because it doesn't need to be strict scrutiny. So yeah, they give you the case Schneider v. New Jersey, right? Maybe you want to check that one out and see, what facts led to this answer choice. But the real reason is B is correct. The court should not uphold the constitutionality of the law because prohibiting speech in a public forum in a way that is not narrowly tailored to serve a substantial government interest. Sidewalks are considered to be a public forum where speech may be regulated as long as it's reasonable in time, place, and manner. This means it must be content neutral, narrowly tailored to serve an important government interest, and be substantially related to that purpose. So I will add this link to the cram guide. So time, place, and manner restrictions um, must comply with. I call it heightened because of the narrowly tailored and the other avenues of communication, right? With heightened intermediate scrutiny. Narrowly tailored to an important government interest substantially, or even maybe more properly, significantly related, and leaving open alternative avenues of communication. For example, and for y'all doing your own cram guides at home, which you guys should all be doing over and over, I like this a lot. The for example, right? For example, a sidewalk next to a government building is a public forum, and a piece of legislation requiring all signs to be forbidden is subject to this test. Let's call it to this content neutral test. That's the kind of the key language there: time, place, and manner, important government interest, narrowly tailored, substantially or significantly related, alternative avenues of communication, and what we would call content neutral. So you're just looking for, buzzwords. I saw Ngozi saying con law is getting the best of you in practice. I do think that like, at least two of the questions so far have been based on memorization of the language for the standards. So if anything, that might be able to help. All right, real quickly. So I was in Vegas this last weekend, and I have a really good relationship with the Sofer family that owns the Fountain Hotel. I tutored their daughter for the LSAT and a few of their students for the bar exam now. And so whenever I'm, in Miami Beach, I'll stop at a hotel, or in Vegas, they have a Fountain Blue as well. So anyway, Raul, my friend, he sets me up with them there. And the chief of relations, I don't know exactly what she does. She, like VIP relations, is actually Leah Marino, who is Dan Marino's daughter. And I've been waiting for a while to meet her because Jonathan Grossman, who does MBE videos, he always uses Dan Marino as like his subject matter. And so I met with Leah, I talked to her, we had a, good conversation. And then I sent her the clip where Grossman is like, so I'm hiding out in the bushes of Marino's house and I shoot him in the head. That's going to be first degree murder. And you can tell I've been thinking about this for a while. So I said that to Leah. She thought it was funny. Hopefully she'll show it to her father, Dan. And then I don't know, maybe something could transpire of it where we can make like a little TikTok video or something, you know, uh, talk about defamation or something like that. I don't know, but I just think it was cool that I was able to connect those dots and show and get that video into Dan's hands. Because when I was studying for the bar and I saw, Grossman making those comments, I was like, I wonder if Dan Marino knows that his name is being dragged through the mud in the random world of bar prep. But because of me, he's probably gonna find out. So that's my little side story. But yeah, and the reason I bring up Jonathan Grossman is because he does MBE videos. His whole spiel is shut up and pick it, which has merit, like don't overthink things, don't over litigate things, and try your best to match like what is the issue, right? That's his thing. What's the issue with the exact language that is the, hammer on the nail. Like here, that last question, the issue was content neutral, time, place, and manner restriction. So the shut up and pick it answer was the one that had narrowly tailored to an important government interest and substantially related, right? Like don't overthink it. Just kind of identify the issue and match the answer to it. And that's a good strategy. you know, I wish he would take it easier on my man Dan Marino, but I do like that approach for what it's worth. I mean, if you do one-on-one sessions with me, I'll go into a little more detail about how I approach questions and when that strategy is useful and when it might be harmful. But like overall, it's a pretty good approach to shut up and pick it and match the language with the issue at hand. All right. So how about this one? In this case, the court will probably rule the ordinance is what? A city has had a severe traffic problem on the streets. As a result, enacted an ordinance prohibiting all sale to the public of food or other items by persons selling directly from trucks, cars, or other vehicles located on city streets. The ordinance included severable grandfather provision exempting from its prohibition vendors who for 20 years or more have continuously sold food or other items from such vehicles located on the streets of the city. A retail vendor of ice cream products qualifies for this exemption and is the only food vendor that does. A yogurt retailer has a business similar to the ice cream vendor, but the yogurt vendor has been selling to the public directly from trucks located on the streets of the city only for the past 10 years. The yogurt vendor filed suit in appropriate federal district court to enjoin the enforcement of this ordinance on the grounds that denies the yogurt vendor the equal protection of the laws. In this case, the court will probably rule that the ordinance is constitutional because it's narrowly tailored to implement the city's compelling interest in reducing traffic congestion and therefore satisfies the strict scrutiny test applicable to such cases. Constitutional because its validity is governed by the rational basis test, and the courts consistently defer to economic choices embodied in such legislation, even if they are plausibly justifiable. Unconstitutional because the nexus between the legitimate purpose of the ordinance and the conduct it prohibits is so tenuous and its provisions are so under-inclusive that the ordinance fails to satisfy the substantial relationship test applicable to such cases, and unconstitutional because economic benefits or burdens imposed by legislators on the basis of grandfather provisions have constantly been declared invalid by courts as per se violations of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This one's a tough one, and we wrote a question similar to it in our Birdie Q Bank that a lot of students get wrong. So take your time with this one. So I have some thoughts about how I would approach this one, but I kind of want to hear from someone in the class. I mean, the most popular answer was B. And if it makes you feel more confident, I agree with you. But why would you choose B here? And how would you eliminate the other answers? Anyone have any thoughts about that?
I can give my thought process on it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the reason why I went with B, I looked at this question as a whole as a rational basis, a rational basis view. So that's the lowest burden to meet. So the burden here would fall onto the ice cream vendor saying that it's not rationally the benefit here is not rationally related. Since it's the lowest burden, it the city itself can meet this burden the easiest. So that's why at the end I picked B because it satisfies rational basis test and just leaves the it satisfies the rational basis test. I didn't like A because I didn't view it as it mentions narrowly tailored, which is not rational basis, and compelling interest. That's not it. And then that would leave me with C and D. And I did not like C because the fact of the second part trying to satisfy a substantial relationship. I just didn't like the phrasing of that. Again, dealing with rational basis.
Right.
And per se violations, I just stay away from per se when it comes to dealing with scrutiny analysis. So that's why I ended up with B here.
Yeah, I like all that. I mean, I thought for a minute maybe it's strict scrutiny because was it speech? Was it content based? Ice cream versus, what is it? Yogurt. But then I was like, no, it's not really their speech. It's more a suspect class or a non-suspect class. And I think you're right. Like food vendors are not suspect classes here. It should be a rational basis test. And the reason I didn't like A, even if I were to think it was speech, is because the government doesn't usually prevail on a strict scrutiny analysis. That's a very high burden to reach. So I thought that your answer was better. That yeah, like B is more plausible. That this is rational basis and they could uphold it because it's an easy burden for the government to meet. Beach kind of satisfied everything for me that I could justify why it was rational basis. And I agree that if it was rational basis, the constitutional justification is probably valid. So let's go with B. Let's see what the explanation has for us. But I think it is B. I hope. Okay, yeah. B is correct. The ordinance regulates who may sell food from vehicles on the street, which implicates neither fundamental right nor suspect class, right? It wasn't a suspect class, it was just food vendors. Therefore, the ordinance would be subject to rational-based review, and the court would defer to any economic choice made by the city so long as it's plausibly justifiable. A is incorrect. The ordinance is not subject to strict scrutiny because it does not impact a fundamental right or suspect class. Moreover, reducing traffic congestion may not be a compelling state interest, right? Like it would be hard for the government to prevail in overcoming strict scrutiny. C is incorrect. The correct standard is not the substantial relationship test, and that's what exactly Nick was keyed into, as stated here, nor is it necessarily true that the limitations imposed by ordinance are so tenuous and uninclusive such that it would fail this test. And then D is incorrect. On the contrary, economic benefits or burdens imposed in a way that do not implicate a fundamental right or suspect class are presumed to be valid under the Equal Protection Clause or the 14th Amendment, right? So they're not per se invalid. They're actually usually valid. They just have to, the burden would be on the plaintiff to prove that they're not legitimately related to a rational interest. So no suspect class was implicated, and rational basis will be upheld if it's conceivable that there's a rational relation between the means selected by the legislator and a legitimate legislative objective. Although legislative purpose or objective in enacting a statute must be legitimate, courts give extreme deference to legislators' right to define its objectives. So long as there's at least one conceivable objective that is legitimate and rationally related to the means, courts will uphold a regulation. So B is correct. The ordinance is constitutional because it's an economic regulation that does not implicate a suspect class or fundamental right, thus triggering the mere rationality review. The choice correctly indicates that the court will give extreme deference to the choices by local legislators regarding economic laws, even if the justification is merely plausible. The city's interest in reducing its extreme traffic problem is conceivably legitimate, and prohibiting direct food sales on the streets is rationally related to that end. So, we'll try to take a point away from this one where um, legislation targeting food vendors, for example, does not implicate a suspect class and will be subject to rational basis review, so long as there is a conceivable or plausible legitimate purpose and rational basis for the legislation, it will be upheld under the rational basis test. Right? So we've had a content neutral one that kind of implicated intermediate scrutiny, and then we've had two rational basis ones, one targeting food vendors and one targeting public school students. So kind of, good exposure, right? By the way, if anyone knows the Marino family, tell them that we could reach a lot of people by turning the table on his name in the bar prep world. When I do the next gen bar, hopefully I'll have a commercial to unveil it with Dan the Man. After seeing, who is it, Philip Rivers come back, I'm like, they should let Marino back in. He's got to be like 60 years old, but he can still play. Better than Tua, right? All right, let's try this one. Which of the following best describes the appropriate standard by which the court should review the constitutionality of the state statutory funding formula? Again, this one is just, is it strict, is it intermediate, or is it rational basis? And we're going to apply the right formula. So public schools in the state are financed in large part by revenue derived from real estate taxes imposed by each school district on the taxable real property located in the state and district. Public schools also receive other revenue from private gifts, federal grants, student fees, and local sales taxes. For many years, the state has distributed additional funds, which come from the state treasury, to local school districts in order to equalize the funds available on a per-student basis for each public school district. These additional funds are distributed on the basis of a state statutory formula that considers only the number of students in each public school district and the real estate tax revenue raised by that district. The formula does not consider other revenue received by a school district from different sources. The school boards of two school districts, together with parents and school children in those districts, bring suit in federal court to enjoin the state from allocating the additional funds from the state treasury to this formula. They allege that the failure of the state in allocating this additional money to take into account a school district's sources of revenue other than revenue derived from taxes levied on real estate located there violates the 14th Amendment. The complaint does not allege that the allocation of the additional state funds based on the current statutory formula has resulted in a failure to provide minimally adequate education to any child. Which of the following best describes the appropriate standard by which the court should review the constitutionality of the state statutory funding formula? A, because classifications based on wealth are inherently suspect, the state must demonstrate that the statutory formula is necessary to vindicate a compelling state interest. B, because the statutory funding formula burdens the fundamental right to education, the state must demonstrate that the formula is necessary to vindicate a compelling state interest. C, because no fundamental right or suspect classification is implicated in this case, the plaintiff must demonstrate that the funding allocation formula bears no rational relationship to any legitimate state interest. And D, because the funding formula inevitably leads to disparities among the school districts and their levels of total funding, the plaintiffs must demonstrate that the funding formula is not substantially related to the furtherance of an important state interest. So, we have a uniform opinion here from the class, which is that everyone thinks the answer is C. And I think it goes back to the first question we did here, that this is going to be rational basis. They're not targeting a suspect class. And B is incorrect. There is no fundamental right to education. There's a fundamental right to direct the education of your child, but you don't have a fundamental right to a public education. Like, what if you live in a town that only has 4 people? How are they going to have a public school in that town, right? Vanya, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, it's not related to this question. It's just a general question. So I know the levels of scrutiny like cold, but I don't know or I haven't taken the time to memorize when the government wins. Well, like yeah, like when the government wins and when it loses and stuff like that. Is that necessarily important to memorize in terms of picking a question? Like I know, like for instance, like the plaintiff rational basis, that's not what I'm referring to, but like the one that, oh, the
Yeah.
government always wins here or loses, is that absolutely necessary
I mean, I don't
for a
think it's absolutely
question?
necessary, nor do I think it's even possible because, it's a case by case basis. There are
Right.
definitely some precedent, where traditionally they win here, traditionally they lose here. But in general, it's like they rarely win when it's strict scrutiny, and they pretty
Mhm.
much always win when it's rational basis. But even so, you don't usually need to do that analysis because there's not really no because the government cannot prevail under strict scrutiny, or yes because the government could prevail under strict scrutiny. They don't really pit those two answer choices against each other. So as long as you know what level of scrutiny is to be utilized, that should get you to the right answer. I mean, again, there might be one, even two questions where I'm wrong, and you need to know what historically has the government, what direction they've gone there. But I wouldn't spend most of my time on that. I would move to civil procedure and real property and start memorizing, definitions and standards of proof and things like that because some of the best advice that I've ever heard when it came to the bar was the test is a mile wide and 6 inches deep. Like there's so many little topics that are tested on it,
Mhm.
but you don't want to go down too many rabbit holes on particular subjects and just try to, the more, areas that you have a solid understanding of, the better compared to like, oh, I'm going to spend all my time, reading the Supreme Court cases to know how they've ruled on these particular issues. Like, again, it's not the worst use of your time, but it's probably not the best. And I'll tell you, like, I don't know. I'm not the common law is not my best subject. I don't know how they've typically ruled. Like when I have free time, I watch Sports Center more than read common law cases. So like it's not something ingrained in my studies, and I've done fine on common law on the exam. But I'll be honest, like it's not the subject I've done the best on the MBE because there are some like I think subjective answers, questionable answers, like convoluted fact patterns that mimic cases that I didn't even know existed, right? So it's a tough subject. And if you want to, score the highest on it, then yeah, I probably would, dig deeper into the actual holdings. But if you want to do just fine on it and then focus on other subjects for
Yeah.
the overall, yeah, I would just memorize
I-
this the energy proof. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just trying to like, I'm trying to do like a list now of like my weak subject areas. And
Yeah.
so, and like little things that little points that I can grab here and there. And then I was like, I don't think this is important, but I wanted to confirm that it is not. Like, I should
Yeah,
focus
it's
on other
not
areas.
super important. And I'm
Yeah.
telling you, over the next 2 weeks, when we do real property and civil procedure and even evidence, there's a
Mhm.
lot. And you'll be like, all right, it's better spending my time here about, is this an abuse of discretion or is this de novo or,
For sure.
or like what's the standard for new trial versus
Mhm.
JMOL. And then real property, we have this list of like 120 vocabulary words. I would spend a lot of time on that too because real property can be a vocab test. So for con law, I wouldn't focus too much on like when the government has historically prevailed and when the government has historically lost. Just more focus on the precise language for the scrutiny levels. I think that's a better use of your time. But yeah,
Thank you.
Morgan, I think this one is C here because we've kind of talked about this, that this is rational basis. There's no fundamental right to education. So let's try C. Yeah, there's no fundamental right to education and wealth is not a suspect class because there's no fundamental right or suspect class at issue. The court will apply rational basis review, which require the plaintiffs to demonstrate that their funding allocation formula is not rationally related to any conceivable legitimate interest. So here I would say on the cram guide, there is no public. Okay, there's no fundamental right to a public education, and wealth is not a suspect class. So funding legislation directed toward students is subject to rational basis review. And it's just kind of, we did two questions that were similar today. That's just the randomness of it all. You have access in the classroom to these exact same workshops that I've done over the years with other classes, and you can watch them too. I think the students tend to like them, and you can kind of play along and answer them as well, which is a good exercise. But in general, the workshops I do on Saturdays for essays is to show y'all what you should be doing, how you should be going through the essays, and take what we did in 2 hours and extend that to 20, 30 hours. Same thing here. Take what we're doing with these practice questions and do them on your own. Do the questions and then write little cram guide points from them, and go review the cram guide points, and that's like the best way to study, in my opinion. All right, let's try the next question. Try and get through these as quickly as we can. So as applied to the couple's case, the court should rule that the state's autopsy statute is blank. Again, another scrutiny level one. A generally applicable state statute requires an autopsy by the county coroner in all cases of death that are not obviously of natural causes. The purpose of the law is to ensure discovery and prosecution of legal activity resulting in death. In the 50 years since its enactment, the statute has been consistently enforced. A husband and wife are sincere practicing members of a religion that maintains it is essential for a deceased person's body to be buried promptly without any invasive procedures, including an autopsy. When the couple's son died of mysterious causes and an autopsy was scheduled, the couple filed an action in state court challenging the constitutionality of the state statute and seeking an injunction prohibiting the county coroner from performing an autopsy on the son's body. In this action, the couple claimed only that the application of this statute in the circumstance of their son's death would violate their right to the free exercise of religion as guaranteed by the First and 14th Amendments. Assume that no federal statutes are applicable. As applied to the couple's case, the court should rule that the state's autopsy statute is constitutional because a dead individual is not a person protected by the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, constitutional because it's a generally applicable statute and is rationally related to a legitimate state purpose, unconstitutional because it's not necessary to vindicate a compelling state interest, and unconstitutional because it's not substantially related to an important state interest. See here, this is a perfect example of what you just asked. Like, you don't need to know how they've historically ruled on autopsy cases. You just need to know what standard will be used, and they kind of tell you which way to go. So here, I think it's probably between B and C in most students' minds, right? C is strict scrutiny, B is rational basis. But remember, to trigger strict scrutiny, it has to be targeting or aimed at a suspect class or a fundamental right, not just have an indiscriminate effect on them. It reminds me of the peyote case, right, where they banned peyote, and then the one native tribe was like, "Hey, we use peyote to worship our Lord, so this is unconstitutional." And the state was like, "No, we weren't targeting you. We just don't want a state addicted to this drug, so we passed this law," right? So I think the class agrees that B is the best answer here because it's rational basis. It's not targeting the religion, it just has an effect on the religion, right? If they said that, like, in order to stop this religion from doing this thing, we're going to pass this law. But they didn't say that. They just said, this law has to ensure the discovery and prosecution of all legal activity resulting in death, right? So it wasn't targeting the religion, therefore it wouldn't trigger a heightened level of scrutiny. And so B is the best answer here, right? So when a neutral law of general applicability impacts religious practice, the law is subject to rational based review. There's no inquiry into the extent of the impact or the sincerity of the religious beliefs. The law must merely be rationally related to a conceivable legitimate state interest. So in order for a law to trigger strict, let's just say heightened scrutiny, it must target or be aimed at a suspect class or a fundamental right, merely having a disparate effect on a religion, for example, will not raise the level of scrutiny. For example, a generally applicable law that requires autopsies will not trigger strict scrutiny merely because it impacts a certain religion, it will be analyzed under rational basis. Right? That's the it has to be aimed at targeting the religion, not just have an inordinate impact on the religion. All right, let's keep going, do some more questions.
Hang on, I don't know why this is like, oh, there we
You're
go.
fine.
Okay.
You're fine. Which of the following statements regarding the constitutionality of this ordinance is most accurate? Okay. So a city has an ordinance that prohibits the location of adult theaters and bookstores presenting sexually explicit performances or materials in residential or commercial zones within the city. The ordinance was intended to protect surrounding property from the likely adverse secondary effects of such establishments. Adult theaters and bookstores are freely permitted in the areas of the city zoned industrial where those adverse secondary effects are not as likely. A storekeeper is denied a zoning permit to open an adult theater and bookstore in a building owned by him in an area zoned commercial. As a result, the storekeeper brings suit in an appropriate court challenging the constitutionality of the zoning ordinance. Which of the following statements regarding the constitutionality of the ordinance is most accurate? I can't believe there's still adult bookstores in 2026, right? But people want what they want. The ordinance is valid because a city may enforce zoning restrictions on speech-related businesses to ensure that the messages they disseminate are acceptable to the residents of adjacent property. The ordinance is valid because a city may enforce this type of time, place, and manner regulation on speech-related businesses, so long as this type of regulation is designed to serve substantial government interest and does not unreasonably limit alternative avenues of communication. The ordinance is invalid because the city may not enforce zoning regulations that deprive potential operators of adult theaters and bookstores of their freedom to choose the location of their businesses. The ordinance is invalid because the city may not zone property in a manner calculated to protect property from the likely adverse secondary effects of adult theaters and bookstores. This question reminds me of the city of Tampa, where the Florida bar exam is held. There's a part of town called Ybor City, Ybor, and that's where like all the strip clubs and adult centers are, right? And they're allowed to do that because it's a valid time, place, and manner restriction. They're not restricting, they're not saying you can't do this. They're just saying you can't do this here, next to the elementary school and whatever it may be. So they can do this, and I agree with the class. I mean, everyone's picking answer choice B here. So yeah, let's rock with B. B is correct. The city is not prohibiting a particular type of speech entirely. Rather, it's regulating where that speech may take place. And the test for valuing time, place, and manner restrictions is whether restrictions designed to serve substantial government interest in a way that does not unreasonably limit alternative avenues of communication. Preventing adverse secondary effects associated with adult theaters and bookstores is a substantial government interest. So, zoning laws restricting adult bookstores to a particular part of town are valid and are subject to time, place, and manner restrictions. So intermediate scrutiny, narrowly tailored to an important government interest, substantially related, and leaving open avenues of communication. And I always do this just to like make it known. I think this is heightened intermediate scrutiny because regular intermediate scrutiny doesn't require the narrowly tailored and the open avenues of communication. And for regular intermediate scrutiny, we're talking about like uh, gender-based discrimination or discrimination against not what would it be illegitimacy, right? Illegitimacy or gender would be regular intermediate scrutiny. Something like time, place, and manner, I think of it as heightened because of the narrowly tailored and the alternative avenues of communication prongs, right? And it is like a very word specific test, right? Are the state's requirements constitutional when applied to the wholly interstate carrier? A state law requires every motor carrier hauling goods in the state's highways to register with and obtain a permit from the state's Transportation Commission. The purpose of this requirement is to facilitate application of the state's valid police, welfare, and safety regulations to carriers using the state's highways. The fee for the registration is nominal, and the commission has no discretion to deny a permit to a carrier that properly registers and pays the registration fee. Are the state's requirements constitutional when applied to the wholly interstate carrier? No, because a carrier's registration nor its payment of a nominal fee is necessary to facilitate the application of state laws to motor carriers. No, because the requirements impose an undue burden on interstate commerce. Yes, because the requirements apply equally to interstate and interstate carriers are the only prerequisites of the issuance of this permit. And yes, because the requirements are the least restrictive means of serving the state's compelling interests in highway safety. This one seems to be the most spread out amongst the answers, so we'll have a little debate here. All right, so we can see the results are pretty spread out. Does anyone take a moment to argue for the answer that they chose, whether it's A, B, C, or D, and we as a class can kind of consider them?
I will, as long as I don't have to go on camera. I had a late night.
You're fine.
Um, so I said it was C because it says every motor carrier hauling goods. And that it was a nominal fee, so it didn't burden anybody overly, but mostly because, they weren't discriminating against out-of-staters versus in-staters. That's why I said C.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. Does anyone disagree with her? I mean, a lot of people pick B and D. I mean, this is why I think in Ngozi I was like, be careful. Just because it says, you know, Commerce Clause or Dormant Commerce Clause, it's not always the answer. You got to think about, the analysis here. And here, I agree that with what Melissa was saying, that it's not impacting interstate versus intrastate carriers any differently. And I mean, this does happen in society, right? There's definitely, permits required for transportation, right? So I think that C is a good answer. Let's try C. Yeah, a non-discriminatory state law may be unconstitutional if the burden on interstate commerce clearly outweighs the state's interest in regulation. Here, the burden on interstate commerce is minimal compared to the state's interest in applying its police, welfare, and safety regulations. Um, Therefore, the state law does not discriminate against interstate commerce and is constitutional. Let me see why B is incorrect. It says B is incorrect. The state law's requirement to register and obtain a permit presents a minimal burden on carriers and does not discriminate against interstate commerce. So remember, the Dormant Commerce Clause is either directly, on its face, it's facially discriminatory, which this one wasn't, because if you look at the question, if you click question again, Morgan, it says, it's like, yeah, right there. It says that it says every motor carrier. It doesn't say out-of-state motor carriers, right? So it's not facially discriminatory. It's just, is it going to, impose an undue burden on interstate commerce? That's going to be subject to the balancing test, right? Whether the burden it places outweighs the benefits. But here it's like they gave you the benefits, right? The police welfare and safety regulations, and it says that the fee is nominal, meaning it's very small, and there's no discretion to deny it to someone. So there's no like discrimination here. So, this is one of the answers one of the questions where it would survive the balancing test of the Dormant Commerce Clause. So a state law that requires um, a licensing fee for carriers and applies equally to interstate and intrastate carriers and is nominal, and the fee is used to facilitate the police powers on the highways should survive the dormant commerce balancing test and be constitutional because it does not unduly burden interstate commerce and it is not facially discriminatory. You understand what I mean by facially discriminatory? Like there's no language that says like, oh, it's definitely, targeting out of state or interstate commerce. It's not facially discriminatory, but it could still be discriminatory if it, you know, under the balancing test unduly burdens interstate commerce. But this one didn't unduly burden interstate commerce, nor was it facially discriminatory, so it would be upheld. So that's why in GOSI, it's not like you always pick Commerce Clause or Dormant Commerce Clause. But if you got that question wrong, it's not going to sink your ship, but just be, a question you want to get right. Okay, so which of the following is the most appropriate basis for the court to dismiss this suit? In response to the need for additional toxic waste landfills in the state legislature enacted a law authorizing a state agency to establish 5 new state-owned and state-operated toxic waste landfills. The law provided the agency would decide the locations and size of landfills after an investigation of all potential sites and a determination that the particular sites chosen would not endanger public health and would be consistent with the public welfare. A community in the state was scheduled for inspection by the agency as a potential toxic waste landfill site. Because the community's residents obtained most of their drinking water from an aquifer that ran under the entire community, a citizens group made up of residents of that community sued the appropriate officials of the agency in federal court. The group sought a declaratory judgment that selecting their community as the site of the toxic waste landfill would be unconstitutional, an injunction preventing the agency from doing so. The agency officials moved to dismiss. What is the most appropriate basis for the court to dismiss this suit? The case presents a non-justiciable political question. The interest of the state in obtaining suitable sites for toxic waste landfills is sufficiently compelling to justify the selection of the community as a location for such a facility. The 11th Amendment bars suits of this kind in the federal courts, or the case is not ripe for decision on the merits. So I think the key language here that said they saw a declaratory judgment that selecting it would be unconstitutional and the injunction will prevent them from doing so. It hasn't actually occurred yet, right? We don't do advisory opinions, right? If they did this, then we want to stop them. There has to be the action done, right? They haven't they're scheduled for inspection and they haven't been chosen yet. If they were chosen, then I think it would be right. But I agree with the class here that this case isn't quite ripe yet because there's no live case or controversy. So yeah, I like D, Morgan. Let's try it. The class likes D. Yeah, the case arguably is not ripe for adjudication because the agency's inspection does not itself pose any risk of harm to the residents' community. The residents face a risk of harm only if the agency selects their community site for landfill, but on these facts, it's unclear whether or when the community would be selected. Right, like that's why it's the best argument. I mean, if it's imminent, right? If they're about to suffer imminent injury or harm, then it could be right. But look out for ripeness. That's just like we were talking about the Commerce Clause and independent, adequate state grounds. Ripeness is a common answer. Like if it's not ripe yet and they give you an answer choice that points to ripeness, it's very likely to be the correct answer. So you could highly consider it. So um, if a town is worried that it might be selected as a landfill site and wants to sue for declare for a declaratory judgment that selecting them would be unconstitutional. This case is arguably not yet ripe because they have not suffered any immediate or apparent injury. Right? Remember, ripeness, it's too early, mootness is too late. This one seemed a little bit too early for them to bring suit. We don't do advisory opinions in federal court. All right, so is the mayor's action constitutional? A clerical employee of a city water department was responsible for sending out water bills to customers. His work in this respect had always been satisfactory. The employee's sister ran in a recent election against the incumbent mayor, but she lost. The employee had supported his sister in the election campaign. After the mayor found out about this, she fired the employee solely because his support for his sister indicated that he was disloyal to the mayor. The city's charter provides that all employees of the city work at the. Is the mayor's action constitutional? No, because public employees have a property interest in employment, which gives them a right to a hearing prior to discharge. No, because the mayor's action violates the employee's right to freedom of expression and association. Yes, because the employee has no property interest in his job, since the city charter provides that he holds the job at the pleasure of the mayor. Yes, because the mayor may require members of her administration to be politically loyal to her. So some of these questions are like variances of each other, where there's another version of this question where it's like, yes, they could do that because it demonstrated that the person wouldn't perform their duties, right? But here, you were just supporting your sister. What are you supposed to do? Not support your sister? You didn't do anything that demonstrated that you wouldn't, perform your functions. But here, I think that yeah, I agree with the class that it would violate the right to freedom of expression, right? It wasn't that they have a proprietary interest in their employment, which gives them a right to a hearing prior to discharge. I mean, that may or may not be true, but you don't have a proprietary interest here because they said you serve at the pleasure of the mayor. You could be fired for a cause. Um, but the issue here is they're not allowed to fire someone just because of who they supported in a campaign. They could fire them if they said, I'm never going to go into that city and do my job there because it's disgusting in there. Like that would be like, okay, your words have demonstrated a lack of a commitment to your functions. But here you have a right to freedom of expression and association in who you vote for. I think B is the right answer, but I kind of want to see what they say about A and C and the property interest. But I just think that B is the best answer here. Let's try B.
Hey Andrew, quick question. So last night I was doing birdie questions and I had a question that was similar to this and it said I got the answer wrong and I read um the explanation obviously and it said like um people who work it something to the effect of people who work in who are considered public employees technically do have a property interest in their positions and that's why this person uh it would be held unconstitutional for this person to be fired.
Um, yeah, let's look at the answer choice. Let's see what they say about that property interest. I don't know the exact question you're talking about, but I'm not sure. They do have a property interest, but this one also says, yeah, they work at the pleasure of the mayor. That's why there's no property interest in the employment. That's the distinction there. That's what I was thinking, that because they work at the pleasure of the mayor, there's no property interest and they could be fired for cause. But here, you still can't fire someone because of their political views or affiliations. So a public employee has a property interest in his or employment and can be fired only for cause. Because the clerical employee signed a charter to work at the pleasure of the mayor, there's no property interest in his employment. So C, the employee is here is at will and therefore does not have a property interest in employment. But the mayor's firing the employee is still unconstitutional under the freedom of expression of association. So that's the difference. If it says they serve at the pleasure of, then there's no property interest. If they just were a public employee, then they would have a property interest. So that's why I said there's variations of this question where it leads to different answer choices. But this one, because they serve at the pleasure of, there's no property interest. So we'll take away both these points. A employee who works at the pleasure of the mayor is an at will employee and doesn't have a property interest in their job as other public employees often have. However, the employee cannot be fired for supporting their sister in an election because this violates their right to freedom of expression and association. So yeah, it was key here that they said that the mayor is that they serve at the pleasure of the mayor, which meant that they didn't have a property interest in their employment. Tough question. There's a couple variations of that question, and that's why you just want to do these questions over and over and over again, so you can kind of see, okay, I know how to distinguish this question from that question and such. All right, let's see the next question. As a matter of constitutional law, the most appropriate result in the suit would be decision that denial of the permit was blank. Okay. Park, can you scroll up a little bit? I don't know if I see the first sentence. Yeah, okay. Members of a religious group calling itself the Friends of Lucifer, okay, believe in Lucifer as their supreme being. Sounds like Generation Z. The members of this group meet once a year on top of Mount Snow, located in a U.S. national park, to hold an overnight encampment and a midnight dance around a large campfire. They believe this overnight encampment and all of its rituals are required by Lucifer to be held on top of Mount Snow. U.S. National Park Service rules that have been consistently enforced prohibit all overnight camping and all campfires on Mount Snow because of the very great dangers overnight camping and campfires would pose in that particular location. As a result, the park superintendent denied a request by the Friends of Lucifer for a permit to conduct these activities on top of Mount Snow. The park superintendent, who is known to be violently opposed to cults and other unconventional groups, had in the past issued permits to conventional religious groups to conduct sunrise services in other areas of that U.S. National Park. The Friends of Lucifer brought suit in federal court against the U.S. National Park Service and the superintendent of the park to compel issuance of the requested permit. As a matter of constitutional law, the most appropriate result in the suit would be decision that denial of the permit was invalid because the free exercise clause of the First Amendment prohibits the Park Service from knowingly interfering with religious conduct, invalid because these facts demonstrate that the action of the Park Service purposely and invidiously discriminated against the Friends of Lucifer, valid because the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment prohibits the holding of religious ceremonies on federal land, and valid because religiously motivated conduct may be subject to discriminatory time, place, and manner restrictions that advance important public interests. Do you mind scrolling up to so we can see the whole question? Okay. And you can scroll down so we can see the answer choices. So this one, I mean, it seemed like they had a valid reason for doing it, right? Great dangers of overnight campfires that would pose in a particular location. So yes, he was motivated because he didn't like this, Friends of Lucifer, and he had issued permits to the other religious groups, but that was in other areas of the park. It didn't say that he'd issued them in this area of the park. And here, overnight camping, would be pose great dangers at that particular location. So I think that he had a non-discriminatory purpose. I don't think even though he was motivated, I think it was valid. And as the class is saying, as a time, place, and manner restriction. So some people are saying B, invalid because the facts demonstrate that the action of the park purposely and individually discriminate against the Friends of Lucifer, or D, valid because religiously motivated conduct may be subjected to non-discriminatory time, place, and manner restrictions that advance important public interest. I agree with Morgan here. I think that yes, he was motivated, but he still wasn't discriminating and targeting them because no one was allowed to camp at this overnight spot, at this particular spot. The government regulate the time, place, and manner of religiously motivated conduct as long as the regulation is neutral and serves an important public interest. Here, the regulation is neutral in its face and its application, the superintendent's views notwithstanding. The interest in public safety is important, therefore the denial of the permit will be valid. Whereas B is incorrect. The facts do not demonstrate purposeful invidious discrimination against the Friends of Lucifer. No group has been allowed to camp all night or light campfires on Mount Snow. So that's exactly what I was saying. Like that particular place, no one was allowed. So let's say religiously motivated discrimination may be upheld as valid time, place, as valid time.
But Andrew, that wasn't religiously motivated. It's like a thing from the side. That has nothing to do with religion.
Right. Like that's what I'm gonna say, notwithstanding, I like that word, notwithstanding the person's uh beliefs, if it is for a important purpose and narrowly tailored. This is when I say, for example, a religious group can be prevented from camping at a particular spot if it is deemed dangerous and no other group has been allowed to camp there, even if the decision maker or let's call the legislator had personal discriminatory motivation against the group, right? So yeah, as Luis was saying, it wasn't religiously it wasn't because of their religion, it was because it was deemed an unsafe spot. So even though he had, some motivation, the facts show that no one was allowed to camp there. It wasn't just targeting that one religion. Okay. So may the president constitutionally create such a commission for this purpose. So the vaccination of children against childhood contagious diseases such as measles, diphtheria, and whooping cough has traditionally been a function of private doctors and local and state health departments. Because vaccination rates have declined in recent years, especially in urban areas, the president proposes to appoint a presidential advisory commission on vaccination, which will be charged with conducting a national publicity campaign to encourage vaccination as a public health measure. No federal statute authorizes or prohibits this action by the president. The activities of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Vaccination will be financed entirely from funds appropriated by Congress to the office of the president for such other purposes as the president may think appropriate. May the president constitutionally create such a commission for this purpose. Yes, because the president has plenary authority to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the United States. Yes, because the action is within the scope of the executive authority vested in the president by Constitution, and no federal statute prohibits it. No, because the protection of children against common diseases by vaccination is a traditional state function and therefore is reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment. No, because Congress has not specifically authorized the creation and support of such a new federal agency. Okay, I think it's between A and B here. It seems pretty fine, right? The president can do this. There was no, it wasn't like he was appropriated money and then used the money for something else. It was for any purpose he may think appropriate. Now, why did I say after A? I don't like plenary authority to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of the people. That's overbroad, right? Be careful for language like that like they can do any measure they want. They can do all things, whatever. Or here, they have plenary power. Like it just seemed a little bit too overbroad. So I like B here. I think that, this was within the scope of the executive authority. And as they said, no federal statute prohibits it. I think that's just a good, solid answer for why they could do this. And, the facts, this is a fact specific question, but the president may set up an advisory commission pursuant to the scope of his powers as chief executive. No federal statute is prohibited. And though Congress shares the power to legislate in this arena, is authorizing him by appropriating funds for this purpose. So, I mean, we'll just make a takeaway. If Congress appropriates funds for the president to use as he deems appropriate, the president may use these funds to set up an executive committee and do a national health related promotional campaign because it is within his authority and not prohibited by Congress. A lot of these questions are reading comprehension questions, and like here it just seemed like, if they would have said Congress appropriated funds to use for, you know, uh, planting flowers on the highway, and then he used them for the measles campaign, that would have been problematic. But here there was no facts to say that he couldn't do this, so it's implied that he could. All right. As applied to the issuance in the United States of an airline ticket for travel between two cities that will not be served by any new airports, this tax is blank. In order to provide funds for a system of new major airports near the 10 largest cities in the United States, Congress levies a tax of $25 on each airline ticket issued in the United States. The tax applies to every airline ticket, even those for travel that does not originate in, terminate at, or pass through any of those 10 large cities. As applied to the issuance in the United States of an airline ticket for travel between two cities that will not be served by any of the new airports, this tax is constitutional because Congress has broad discretion in choosing the subjects of its taxation and may impose taxes on subjects that have no relation to the purpose for which the tax funds will be expended. Constitutional because an exemption for the issuance of tickets for travel between cities that will not be served by the new airports would deny the purchasers of all other tickets the equal protection of the laws. Unconstitutional because the burden of the tax outweighs its benefits for passengers whose travel does not originate in, terminate, or pass through any of the 10 largest cities, or unconstitutional because the tax adversely affects the fundamental right to travel. Now, the last question, I was like, I didn't like answer A because it gave the president plenary power. One area where there is plenary power is actually the taxing and spending of Congress. It's, something that I remember, like one of the, I don't know, Convisor or whoever, one of the OGs of this, they said like bar exam tip, be very hesitant to pick against a taxing and spending measure. It's the same resource that said be very hesitant to pick necessary and proper as its own answer. It was another like kind of trick or tip from the bar exam that like most taxing and spending measures are going to be valid because Congress does have plenary power to tax and spend for the general welfare. So like I feel like this type of tax happens all the time where it's like, I'm paying a tax on my airline ticket even though I'm flying to different airports. It's for the general health and welfare of the people. So I agree with the class here that A is probably the best answer, that, even though it's not related, they do have broad discretion, right? Plenary power, broad discretion for taxing and spending. So A is correct. Congress's power to tax and to spend funds are both very broad, and there's no requirement that what is spent be related in any way to what is taxed. Okay, so Congress has broad taxing and spending powers, and it is not necessary that what is spent is related to what is taxed. For example, Congress can pass a law taxing all airline tickets to build or support 10 specific airports in the country, even if the tickets do not originate or pass through the airports that will receive the funding. Right? It's broad taxing and spending powers. So be very hesitant to pick against a taxing and spending measure on the MBE. That's some, food for thought. It's all food for thought, because at the end of the day, you have 200 questions. Every question is an island, and you can't just rely on some little gimmick that you were taught to pick the right answer. You have to read each question carefully, read through the answer choices, and pick the best answer. That's why I said I like Jonathan Grossman, Shut Up and Pick It, but only to an extent. I know a lot of people who've come to me, right? They say, I'm not the first person people call, I'm the last. Usually by the time people come to me in my program and work with me, it's because they've worked with all these other things that haven't worked. And then they find me, and that's the last stop, and we get the job done. And the reason why what they've done hasn't worked is because, some of those gimmicks kind of don't work for everyone. They're just too like, oh, shut up and pick it. It's B. It's like, no, you should have read through C and D and realized that C was a better answer. So like, there's a sweet spot, a balancing point, but it's like every question is an island. You need to read each question carefully. It's not a minimum competency test by any means, but like I was telling Ivania, you don't need to read every case holding and know how the Supreme Court has ruled in every case, but you do need to know the precise language of the levels of scrutiny and things like that. So, there's a balance, and I think there's merit to some of these approaches that other professors utilize, but like the way I teach, I think is proper, that you really do need to know the answers, why the answers are correct. You need to do a lot of outside studying and have a huge, knowledge base. And then when you're approaching the questions on test day, each one, very carefully and pick the right answer and the right reasoning and kind of put it all together. But when in doubt, I think shut up and pick it is a fair approach. All right, which of the following is the strongest argument in support of the state medical board? A doctor who was licensed to practice medicine in a particular state was convicted in state court of improperly distributing specified drugs by writing prescriptions for fictitious persons. Under state law, such an abuse of the prescription writing privilege requires revocation of a doctor's license. After it received an official notification of the doctor's conviction, the state board revoked the doctor's license without affording the doctor any opportunity from a hearing. The doctor has sued the board in state court to set aside the revocation, alleging deprivation of property without due process of law because the board did not provide an opportunity for a trial type hearing before revoking the license. The doctor does not deny a conviction or the factual basis for it. Which of the following is the strongest argument in support of the medical board? A doctor's license to practice is a privilege, not a right, and therefore is not property within the meaning of the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. Due process requires a balancing of interests, and the state's interest in preventing drug abuse outweigh the doctor's interest in the particular procedure followed in the disciplinary proceeding. The adjudicated facts necessary to revoke the doctor's license were determined in the criminal trial, and therefore due process does not require any further trial type hearing. The licensing board was required to summarily revoke the doctor's license because Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution requires the licensing board to give them full faith and credit the doctor's criminal conviction. So for this one, you don't need a hearing if it said a conviction will result in the loss of your license and you're already convicted. As C is saying, the adjudicated facts necessary were already determined. Sorry, I'm just gonna ask. Okay. Yeah, I like C here, right? The adjudicated facts were already determined in the hearing. So there's no need for notice and hearing if you've already had a trial that led to a conviction and the statute says a conviction leads to the loss of your license. Like you were found guilty in criminal court. What are they gonna find you in a notice and hearing? So the strongest argument is that the board's revocation license without a hearing is the fact that the doctor already received extensive procedural due process protections to his trial as a criminal defendant, which would render an additional hearing unnecessary. So I'll just write this takeaway that says due process requires notice and hearing, but if you lose your license subject to a provision where a criminal conviction will revoke your license and you are convicted in a criminal trial, there is no further right to a notice and a hearing because the adjudicative facts necessary have already been determined and you already received due process of the law. Right? Like if they found you guilty in criminal court and the stipulation was a conviction leads to the loss of your license, then there's no reason to have a further hearing because you already received your due process in court. So tough question, but something that you guys can hopefully understand moving forward. All right, let's try the next one. Okay. The constitutionality of this federal statute may be most easily justified on the basis of Congress to blank. A federal statute prohibits the sale or resale in any place or country of any product intended for human consumption or ingestion into the human body that contains designated chemicals known to cause cancer, unless the product is clearly labeled as dangerous. The constitutionality of the federal statute may be most easily justified on the basis of Congress to regulate commerce amongst the states, enforce the 14th Amendment, provide for the general welfare, promote science and the useful arts. And goes, yeah, I think this is where it's like, yeah, it seems like Commerce Clause, right? Like, provide for the general welfare is true, taxing and spending, but it's more established that Congress will use the Commerce Clause. So if you're between, a general welfare answer and a Commerce Clause answer, this goes back to what Ngozi was asking about. Like, do you just always pick Commerce Clause? No, not always. But if you're between A and C here, Commerce Clause is a much more common answer. It's much more established justification than the general welfare. Like C is not necessarily false, but A is the best answer here. I think this is a good Commerce Clause answer where, yeah, this is channels, instrumentalities, and economic activities that in effect have an aggregate effect on interstate commerce. So it's a broad power, right? C is incorrect. While they can spend for the general welfare, they may not directly regulate for the general welfare, right? This wasn't a spending measure, it was a regulation, and regulation would have to be upheld or justified in the Commerce Clause. So let's just say the Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate the channels, instrumentalities, and economic activities that in an aggregate have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. And then I'd say the general welfare clause allows Congress to tax and spend, but not to regulate. therefore, a regulation of, I'm not sure what they're regulating here, but let's just say of economic activity is most properly justified by the Commerce Clause. All right, let's try some more. So, which of the following is the best argument supporting a motion to dismiss the lawsuit? I'll relaunch the poll. So, a state law prohibits the withdrawal of groundwater from any well within the state for the use of another state. The express purpose of the law is to safeguard the supply of water for state citizens. Adoption of the law, state law, followed enactment of a federal statute providing that the transport of groundwater from one state to another may be restricted or prohibited in accordance with the laws of the state in which water originates. I like this question. An association of water users in a neighboring state has filed, I like that, water users. I feel like that's humans. In a neighboring state has filed suit to have the state law declared unconstitutional and enjoined on the ground that it violates the negative implications of the Commerce Clause. Which of the following is the best argument supporting a motion to dismiss the lawsuit? The law promotes a compelling state interest that outweighs any burden on interstate commercial activity that might result from the state regulation of its groundwater. Groundwater located within a state is not itself an article of interstate commerce, and therefore state regulation of the withdrawal of such groundwater does not implicate the Commerce Clause. The 10th Amendment reserves to the states plenary authority over the regulation of the natural resources located within their respective borders, or the federal statute explicitly consents to a state's regulation of groundwater in a way that would otherwise violate the negative implications of the Commerce Clause. So I said this a bit earlier. There's two commonly tested exceptions to the Dormant Commerce Clause, and you should definitely be familiar with them. The first one is the market participant rule, where it's like if the state owns and operates, the factory or the well or whatever it may be, then they can regulate because they're acting as a market participant. The other one is this one right here. It's going to be express authorization by Congress. If Congress or the federal government or federal statute allows them to do activity that would otherwise violate the Dormant Commerce Clause, then it's going to be exempted, right? And that's what happened here. It said they followed a federal statute that literally said they can restrict or prohibit this. So it would violate the Dormant Commerce Clause otherwise, but because it's expressly authorized by Congress, I think that I agree with the class here that, yeah, and I agree with Morgan too, that D is the best answer because there was a federal statute that explicitly allowed them to do this, even though it would otherwise violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. So when Congress explicitly grants a state the authority to regulate commerce in a particular manner, it will not run afoul of the Dormant Commerce Clause and be held constitutional. So I'll put this on the cram guide that says one exception to the Dormant Commerce Clause is express authorization by Congress or a federal statute. So states may enact legislation that would normally violate the Dormant Commerce Clause if expressly authorized by the federal government. I'm just going to put in parentheses another common exception to the DCC is the market participant rule, where the state is acting as a market participant. I think those two are pretty heavily tested, so I would definitely, be familiar with those two exceptions to the Dormant Commerce Clause. States cannot enact legislation that unduly burdens or directly discriminates against interstate commerce, but they can if it's expressly authorized by Congress or it's under the market participant exception. Okay. Must the prominent limousine company comply with the new rule of the Redville City Council? A federal statute provides that cities in which certain specified airports are located may regulate the rates and services of all limousines that serve those airports without regard to the origin or destination of the passengers who use those limousines. It's kind of the exact same question we just did back to back. A federal statute is authorizing the state action. The cities of Redville and Greenville are located adjacent to each other in different states. The airport serving both of them is located in Redville, and is one of those airports specified in federal statute. The Redville City Council has adopted a rule that requires any limousine serving to the airport to charge only the rates authorized by the Redville City Council. A prominent limousine service has a lucrative business transporting passengers between Greenville and the airport in Redville at much lower rates than those required by the Redville City Council. It transports passengers in interstate traffic only. It does not provide local service within Redville. The new rule adopted by Redville City Council will require the prominent limousine service to charge the same rates as limousines operating only in Redville. Must the prominent limousine service comply with the new rule of the Redville City Council? Yes, because the airport is located in Redville, and therefore the City Council's exclusive regulatory authority over all transportation to and from the airport. Yes, because Congress has authorized this form of regulation by Redville, and therefore removed any constitutional impediments to it that may have otherwise existed. No, because the rule would arbitrarily destroy a lucrative existing business and therefore would amount to a taking without just compensation. That's not a good argument. And then D, if you scroll down a bit, what does D say? No, because the limousine service engages in interstate commerce, and this rule is an undue burden on that commerce. The answer is D, unless an exception applies. And here an exception, I said the answer is D, someone click D. The answer is D, unless an exception applies. There is an exception here, right? The exception is that it was expressly authorized. If you go to the first, two sentences, it says Congress expressly allows states to do this type of regulation. And yeah, a federal statute provides that the cities may regulate the rates and services without regard to the origin or destination. So D would be the right answer if it wasn't expressly authorized by Congress. But here, because it was expressly authorized by Congress, B is the correct answer. So by enacting the federal statute, Congress gave the Redville City Council the power to set the limousine rates. As a result, no constitutional problems come up with regard to the Supremacy Clause or the Commerce Clause imposed on the interstate commerce by the Council's rule has been federally sanctioned pursuant to congressional commerce powers. I mean, I don't even need to write a point on this one because it's the exact same as the other one. If it's expressly authorized by Congress, then they can enact legislation that would otherwise run afoul of the Dormant Commerce Clause. But here it said a federal statute authorized this. So we just did back-to-back questions where they reinforced that point. So, anything from this workshop today, you should truly understand that's a common exception to the Dormant Commerce Clause is express authorization by Congress. Okay. Which of the following best states the appropriate burden of persuasion in this case? A city zoning ordinance requires that anyone who proposes to operate a group home obtain a special use permit from the city zoning board. The zoning ordinance defines a group home as a residence in which 4 or more unrelated adults reside. An individual applied for a special use permit to operate a group home for convicts during their transition from serving prison sentences to their release on parole. Although the proposed group home met all the requirements for a special use permit, the zoning board denied the individual's application because of the nature of the proposed use. The individual sued the zoning board seeking declaratory injunctive relief on the constitutional grounds. Which of the following best states the appropriate burden of persuasion in this action? So who's being targeted here? It seems like they're targeting convicts, right? I don't think that's going to be a suspect class. Because housing is a fundamental right, the zoning board must demonstrate that the denial of the permit is necessary to serve a compelling state interest. Lord, if housing was a fundamental right, the streets of California and Colorado and other places would not look like they do. There's a lot of people who don't have housing. Because the zoning board's action has the effect of discriminating against a quasi-suspect class in regard to basic subsistence right, the zoning board must demonstrate that the denial of the permit is substantially related to an important state interest. Again, this isn't gender illegitimacy. I don't think it's a quasi-suspect. Because the zoning board's action invidiously discriminates against a suspect class, the zoning board must demonstrate that the denial of the permit is necessary to serve a compelling state interest. I mean, A and C are both wrong. There's no fundamental right here, and there's no suspect class here. Because the zoning board's action is the nature of an economic or social welfare regulation, the individual seeking the permit must demonstrate that the denial of the permit is not rationally related to a legitimate state interest. I agree. They're targeting convicts here. Convicts are not suspect class. Not even close. The zoning board's denial of the permit did not discriminate against a suspect class, nor did it unduly burden the exercise of fundamental right. Therefore, the denial triggers rational basis scrutiny. So housing is not a fundamental right, and convicts are not a quasi-suspect class. So the takeaway here, let's just do both of them. Housing is not a fundamental right, and convicts are not a suspect or quasi-suspect class. Therefore, a law restricting the number of unrelated convicts living in a house is subject to rational basis review. Right? I mean, the key is to memorize what the fundamental rights are, memorize what the quasi-suspect classes are. And then if they give you one and it's not on that list, then it's going to be rational basis, right? Rational basis is everything else besides fundamental rights, quasi-suspect classes, etc. Okay. An unconstrued state law prohibited this distribution within the state of seditious propaganda. The state prosecuted United States post office letter carriers under this law for delivering propaganda from a foreign county to state residents. Which of the following statements is an inaccurate? If ever you see which of the following is not true, which highlight, underline, make sure you don't get a question wrong because you misread the question. That's like, I think most people who fail this test, if they're only a couple points away, it's because of careless reading mistakes more than anything. So just don't allow that to happen on test day. Make sure you're answering the right question. Here they're saying, what is an inaccurate description of state laws applied to letter carriers? Is it unconstitutional bill of attainder? A bill of attainder is punishment without trial. This is not a bill of attainder. A is probably the answer. It's void for vagueness. I think so. What is seditious propaganda? I have no idea what that means. That's vague. It may not be applied to letter carriers because they're employees of a federal instrumentality carrying out an authorized function. Yeah, that's true, right? The state cannot, punish the federal government for doing federal activity. That's true. It unconstitutionally abridges rights protected by the First and 14th Amendment. I mean, that's the most true. It's definitely, freedom of speech and some sort of, due process, equal protection claim. The only thing it's not is a bill of attainder. There's nothing in here that provides punishment without trial. So takeaway from this is you got to know what a bill of attainder is. So a bill of attainder inflicts punishment without a judicial trial upon named individuals or those who engage in certain prior conduct. So let's just write that down. A bill of attainder imposes punishment without trial. Fair enough, right? And then we'll say what vagueness is. Vagueness is when a law or ordinance is unclear as to what is being punished. Right? Vagueness, overbreadth, bill of attainder, impairment of contracts, ex post facto laws. Those are just vocabulary terms that like you should know. And if you know what they mean, you should be able to get the questions right. All right, let's do a couple more. I think we're getting to the finish line here. So in this suit, the court will probably rule what? A state wanted to prevent its only Major League Baseball team privately owned from moving to a rival state. After heated political debate in the legislature, the state enacted legislation providing for a one-time grant of $10 million in state funds. They tricked you a lot on this. Just because a private entity receives a grant of money, that doesn't make them, public. It's not state action. Just because they received a one-time grant of $10 million in state funds to the baseball team to cover part of the projected income losses the team would suffer during the next 5 years if remained in the state. The legislation required that the team remain in the state for at least 10 years if accepted the grant. After accepting the grant, the owners of the baseball team decided to build a new $150 million stadium in the state. As plans for the construction of the new stadium proceeded, it became evident that all the contractors and subcontractors would be white males and that they'd been chosen by the owners of the baseball team without public bids because these contractors and subcontractors successfully built the only other new baseball stadium in the region. Several contractors who were females or members of minority racial groups filed suit against the owners of the baseball team in federal district court to compel public solicitation of bids for the construction of the new stadium on equal opportunity basis and to enjoin construction of the stadium until compliance was ensured. Their only claim was that the contracting prices of the owners of the baseball team denied them the equal protection of laws in violation of the 14th Amendment. In the suit, the court will probably rule that the nexus between the actions of the owners of the baseball team and the one-time grant of money to them by state is sufficiently substantial to subject their action to the limitation of the 14th Amendment. No, that's what I said is not true. It's only a one-time grant. The intense public preoccupation with the activities of Major League Baseball teams, coupled with the fact that baseball is considered to be our national pastime, is sufficient to justify application of the 14th Amendment to the activities of Major League teams. I mean, that's not true at all. And like, if you watched baseball this past season, it seems to be more of a Japanese game than an American game anyway, or Dominican or Venezuelan, right? In the absence of additional evidence of state involvement in the operations or decisions of the owners of the baseball team, a one-time grant of state monies to them is insufficient to warrant treating their actions as subject to limitations of 14th Amendment. That's what I anticipated. I saw a one-time grant of money. I was like, this is not state action. I like C. The issues presented by this case are non-justiciable political questions because there's a lack of just judicially manageable standards to resolve them, and they are likely to be deeply involved in partisan politics. I mean, that's not true. If this was state action, it would be a great argument for equal protection, discrimination on race and gender. I mean, it's pretty clear that's what they did here, but they were allowed to do that because they were a private party, right? The 14th Amendment only limits the power of states and state actors. The baseball franchise is a private entity, and this amendment cannot reach it unless somehow it become a state actor. The franchise can only be a state actor if it performs some traditional government function or if the government has been very involved in the management of the franchise. And A is incorrect. The grant of money by itself is not enough involvement for the franchise to be deemed a state actor. So the takeaway here is in order for a private party to be deemed a state actor, they must participate in some form of state. Can you go back to the answer real quick? I want to use the language they use. I like that language. They some traditional government function. They must participate in some form of traditional government function. Merely receiving funds from the government is typically not enough to implicate state action. All right, let's keep going. I'm kind of committed to getting to 25 questions, but common law questions can be a little bit longer, so it might take us a little bit, but I think we're getting close. So is this law constitutional? Under state law, oil and gas rights can pass by will or through intestate succession. Some oil and gas rights in the state have been divided into very small interests after several generations of passing by intestate succession. It's therefore it's difficult to enter into extraction contracts in the state because the need to include large number of heirs for any given tract of land. To remedy this problem, the state has enacted a law that provides that at the death of the owner of less than 1% of the oil and gas interest in a tract of land, the owner's oil and gas rights are extinguished and his or her interests are transformed pro rata to the remaining owners. Is this law constitutional? Absolutely not. You are literally taking their property. And just because it's less than 1%, we're talking about oil here. You know, when I did a presentation to my business networking group, I told them the most valuable resource in the world is education. That's why you guys should all send your kids to tutor with my company. But in the back of my mind, I was like, oil is pretty damn close, right? Oil is a really valuable resource. So even if you have less than 1%, I mean, that's still a taking, right? So it affects the taking of property without just compensation. I agree. The law on nice. I typically, Morgan, just like to read all the other answers just in case, but that one's pretty obvious. No, because the law unduly burdens interstate commerce and oil and gas production. Yes, because the proper inheritance is a privilege created by state law. Yes, because the law rationally promotes legitimate state interest in fostering resource development. No, we said it was a taking. The law affects the taking of property because it extinguishes an owner's interest in the affected property without just compensation. It does not matter that the owner's interest in the property is very small. So, a governmental taking requires just compensation. It does not matter how small the taking is. For example, a law that requires estates to extinguish gas and oil rights that are under 1% of the tract of land still amounts to a governmental take. Yo, Nick, are you still there? I don't know.
Yep.
What time's the first game start today?
1.
It already started? Damn.
Yep.
All right, that's why I feel like a couple people left. Who was the first game?
Buffalo, Jacksonville.
Ooh, that's a good one. All right, let's try to finish this up so we can watch the Bills and the Jags. And then the Eagles are the next game, right? The afternoon one?
Correct. They're at 4:30.
Nice. I might need to take a nap before that, honestly. Okay. So, a suit by the appropriate parties challenges the constitutionality of set-asides. In the suit, the most appropriate ruling on the basis of the applicable United States Supreme Court precedent would be that the set-asides are blank. Sorry, let me reload this pool. So reload this poll. So what are the set-asides doing here? An independent municipal water supply district was incorporated under the applicable laws of a particular state. The district was created solely to supply water to an entirely new community in a recently developed area of the state. The new community is racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically diverse, and the community has never engaged in any discrimination against members of minority groups. The five-member elected governing board of the newly created district contains two persons who are members of racial minority groups. At its first meeting, the governing board of the district adopted a rule unqualifiedly setting aside 25% of all positions on the staff of the district and 25% of all contracts to be awarded to district members of racial and minority groups. The purpose of the rule was to help redress the historical discrimination against these groups in the country and help them achieve economic parity with other groups in our society. Assume that no federal statute applies. A suit by appropriate parties challenges the constitutionality of set-asides. In the suit, the most appropriate ruling on the basis of applicable U.S. Supreme Court precedent would be the set-asides are blank. So they seem to be favoring a minority group here, right? Unconstitutional because they would deny other potential employees or potential contractors the equal protection of the laws. Unconstitutional because they would impermissibly impair the right to contract of other potential employees or potential contractors. Constitutional because they would assure members of racial minority groups the equal protection of laws. Constitutional because the functions and activities of the district are of proprietary nature rather than government nature and therefore are not subject to the usual requirements of the 14th Amendment. I mean, this is a tough question. I'm moving kind of quickly now. My gut tells me that this is unconstitutional and it's an equal protection issue, right? I don't think it's impairment of contracts. I think it's equal protection. I think they're favoring a certain racial group. I like A over C. And then D just doesn't sound good to me. A proprietary nature rather than government nature. Um, I don't think so. I think this is government activity, right? It's like the district. Yeah, let's try A. Let's see. All right, most of the class was with me there. A is correct. The set-asides are suspect classification based on race, which must satisfy strict scrutiny, which requires that the racial classification serve a compelling interest. The purpose of the set-asides is to redress historical discrimination, generally not to remedy prior discrimination by this particular district. This does not constitute a compelling interest to satisfy strict scrutiny. The set-asides are therefore unconstitutional. If you scroll down to the extended explanation, just want to see if they add anything. Please scroll down a little bit more. So A is correct. In this case, they classify on the basis of race and they must pass strict scrutiny. There's been no history of discrimination. The purpose is explicitly to help redress. The interest in remedying the effects of societal discrimination without any specific prior discrimination by the agency is not compelling. The set-asides are unconstitutional. Okay, so I would say set-asides requiring a district to favorably employ a particular race are likely unconstitutional as violations of the Equal Protection Clause because historic redress of societal wrongs is not a compelling government interest. I mean, that's what the Supreme Court says. You know, I think some people might disagree and say there is some reason that that should be allowable, but just gotta go with what the Supreme Court says. All right, the federal district court should what? A city's police officer shot and killed a plaintiff's friend as he attempted to escape arrest for armed robbery committed. The plaintiff brought suit in federal court against the police department and the city police officers involved, seeking only a judgment declaring unconstitutional the state statute in which the police acted. The newly enacted statute authorized the police to use deadly force when necessary to apprehend a person who has committed a felony. In his suit, the plaintiff alleged that the police would not have killed his friend if the use of deadly force had not been authorized by statute. Okay, the problem here is it's not the friend's estate suing, it's the friend's friend, right? I don't think there's standing here. You can't sue on behalf of your friend. You know, maybe there's organizational standing, maybe there's some sort of caretaker standing, or you know, standing as an estate, but I don't think you can sue on behalf of your friend alone. So decide the case on the merits because it raises a substantial federal question, dismiss the case because it's non-justiciable, non-justiciable. Dismiss the action because it does not prevent a case or controversy. I think that's the best answer. There's no standing here. Dismiss the action because the 11th Amendment prohibits federal courts from deciding cases of this type. I mean, I just think that it's the friend who, it's his estate should have sued. You can't sue on behalf of your friend, unfortunately. Yeah, the plaintiff does not have standing because it was his friend. So that one's a pretty easy one for me to take a point away. A friend does not have standing to sue on behalf of a deceased person. Therefore, the case. Can you go back to the question? I want to see what the answer was. They said the case is not um, live, right? Can you go to the question if you scroll down and look at the question again? I'm sorry. Yeah, it does not present a case or controversy. Okay. So a friend does not stand to sue on behalf of a deceased person. Therefore, the case does not present an actionable controversy. Right. Just look for that. If someone's trying to sue on behalf of their friend, they're not going to have standing. And like, I would have liked the answer to say he does not have standing. They said there's no live case or controversy. I mean, it means the same thing, and you kind of got to be able to pick that apart. But that's just how this test goes. All right. I feel like we're almost getting to the end of the 25. Oh yeah, perfect timing. All right. Usually we go for review all the ones we got wrong, but today you guys were right on top of things. We got every question right. So I'll just show y'all real quickly what we've done today and um what the plan is, right? So this cram guide, we started it with contracts, then we did tours, then we did con law. We're going to do all the other subjects, and then we're going to continue and do like a complete review. And you could see that we've done these in the past, and we have, in the week 8 review or wherever it may be in this classroom, we have all subjects cram guide. So this, the master cram guide, this is the one we did from July. And then this master cram guide, that's like 51 pages. It's like multiple administrations that I've kind of compiled them together, and we'll continue to add. So this master cram guide will probably get to be like 70 pages, and then we'll have a master one for February 2026, like we had for July 2025. It's a good idea to go back over these other cram guides that we've done because they're it's only a small sample size, right? If you take the LSAT, that's a common flaw. This was only 25 questions. You want to go over all of them, do them on your own, et cetera, et cetera. And then one other thing I'll show you is here where it says additional videos and it says previous MBE lectures and videos. If you click that Google Drive and you go to like the July 2023 course or the July 2024 course, those are some examples where, let's say if you click the July 2023 course, you could go to week recon and you can see here we did the workshop there. So you could watch, the workshop that I did another year. And, sometimes there's some funny students or whatever. I did these questionnaire videos too. So you could do the con law questionnaires. These questionnaires were more condensed than the ones that we have for you all now. Like we expanded them and Katya filled them all out. So the questionnaires have become better and more detailed. But yeah, that's another good place to study is these completed questionnaires. And we did them in class together. We went over everything. I mean, there's a lot of different angles you want to take at studying, but at the end of the day, if you have no idea what to do, you're totally lost. I would go on, Birdie and do our practice questions, maybe Adaptable or UWorld or Helix or, another bar prep QBank, and I would just hammer away at questions. I think that, everyone who passes the MBE, if you ask them, what was the most instructive thing you did? They're going to say practice questions, practice questions, practice question. So what we did today was just kind of like a sample of what you should be doing on your own as much as possible, doing practice questions, and then writing down the takeaway. I mean, if it's a question you got right and you know why you got it right and it was super easy, it might not be necessary to write the takeaway. But if you got it wrong or you got it right and you're a little bit unsure, I think it's always a good practice to write the takeaway in your cram guide and then, be constantly reviewing them and, committing them to memory. So I really appreciate everyone for hanging out with me tonight. We got the Miami Hurricanes in the championship game. That's a good sign. And hopefully the Eagles are going to move forward as well. And yeah, I'm gonna stop this recording, but I'll check out what people said in the group chat too. So thank you all so much.